Good morning. I wish to express my greetings to all the delegates of the Second National Mission Congress, and likewise my gratitude to Bishop Arturo Bastes and to Bishop Socrates Missiona for inviting me to share my studies on the early Spanish missions in the Philippines. A topic which is still marginalized um, for apparently for two reasons. One is because of the late 19th century nationalist prejudice against the Spanish missionaries who were regarded as harbingers and enablers of Spanish imperialism. And the other is lack of access to Spanish documents, especially in the early period of Hispanization, which means that historians have to access these records from the Spanish archives, which remains restricted until very recent times when documents from state archives in Spain had been opened to scholars online. Earlier on, most of these documents can only be accessed by visiting actually these archives in Spain. And even until today, many of the religious archives have not yet been accessible online. And therefore, historians have to personally do the research in the archives, particularly of the Franciscans, of the Augustinians, and of the other religious orders who were pioneers of the Spanish missions in the Philippines. Drawing from substantial unutilized Spanish archival sources, this lecture will focus on the first 50 years of the Spanish regime, from 1565 until 1615, considered as the seminal period of Catholic evangelization, but least known even among contemporary Filipino historians. On 20 September 1521, an impressive armada composed of 5 ships led by Pernao Magalhaes, otherwise known in history as Ferdinand Magellan, left the shores of Sanlúcar de Barrameda in Cadiz. When the expedition landed in the port of Cebu, Magellan, through one of these 3 secular priests who served as chaplain of the expedition, Father Pedro de Valderrama, took upon himself the religious duty, not only the introduction of the natives to the colorful ceremonies of the Catholic faith, but also by solemnizing the first baptism of the aristocratic families of the islands. As tokens of kinship in their Catholic faith, Magellan gave the chiefly couple of Cebu their respective baptismal gifts. Humabon received the statue of the suffering Christ, known in Catholic iconography as the Ecce Homo, and his wife, Juana, the Santo Niño. The auspicious beginnings of the Spanish colonial and evangelical incursions shortly ended in disaster when Magellan was killed in the Battle of Mactan, and a large number of his survivors treacherously massacred in Cebu by Humabon's own men. Few days after holding the rousing Catholic ceremonies. Although the other plans of Magellan were aborted by his death and the survivors' acrimonious relationship with the natives, the Santo Niño and other religious artifacts left behind by the expedition serve as enduring testimonies of the earliest dramatic encounter of the Spaniards with the natives. Despite the catastrophic failure, the Magellan expedition subsequently opened the sea lanes for a series of Spanish expeditions to the islands, such as the Loaiza, the Saavedra, and the most important of them, the Villalobos expedition, accompanied by a number of chaplains who were seculars, namely Padre Cosme del Mas, Padre Don Martin, and Padre Juan Delgado. Another group of priests, composed of 4 Augustinians led by Fray Jeronimo de Santisteban, accompanied by Fray Nicolas de Peria, Sebastian de Trasera, and Alonso Alvarado, formed part of the expedition. These were the first religious to join a Spanish expedition to the east, thus pioneering the missions in the annals of Philippine church history. After enduring extreme hunger, sickness, and risk, and tremendous risk, for almost 7 long years, while only the baptism of a dying child by Fray Jeronimo de Santisteban was counted as their most important accomplishment. The eminent Augustinian chronicler, Fray Gaspar de San Agustin, proudly hailed this event as a resounding spiritual triumph. To quote San Agustin, who could fathom the joy of the religious at seeing the first converts to Christianity in these islands by their hands. What is certain is that everything they have done so far was worth the effort to save that soul, even if they did not see other fruit in their 7 years of their pilgrimage. Unquote. These accomplishments were certainly sources of spiritual inspiration for Philip II to launch not only a full-scale conversion of the heathens under their sphere of influence, but to establish a lasting colonial outpost in this part of Southeast Asia. In 1564, an expedition was dispatched from Mexico bound for the Philippines. Known in Philippine history textbook as the Legazpi Ordaneta expedition, since this impressive fleet was placed under the command of an aging clerk from the Basque region named Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, who surprisingly had no pronounced credentials of navigational expertise. Hence, the actual navigational command laid in the hands of an Augustinian friar, Fray Andres de Ordaneta, a renowned mariner who had joined a number of expeditions to Asia and the Philippines before donning the religious habit of an Augustinian. Ordaneta likewise headed a small band of Augustinians composed of friars Diego de Herrera, Martin de Rada, Andres de Aguirre, and Pedro Gamboa, who would lay down the foundations for the sustained and enduring missionary works of their order in the islands and of some portions of Asia. This expedition docked in the port of Cebu on April 27, 1565, exactly 44 years after the death of Ferdinand Magellan in Mactan. The expedition launched its military might to place the islands under the Spanish imperial banner. As the Spaniards advanced deep into the hinterland of the port village of Cebu, one of Legazpi's men named Juan Camus found the image of the child Jesus in a hut, which became famous in history as the Santo Niño de Cebu. The hope for the immediate cessation of hostilities dawned upon the Spaniards when a niece of Tupas, who was among those earliest catechized by the Spaniards, accepted baptism and was named Isabel, after the name of the wife of Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, Isabel Garces. A few days after, Isabel was married to one of Legazpi's crew named Maestre Andrea, and this was reckoned as the earliest Christian wedding ever solemnized in Philippine church history. While the process of Catholic conversion began by the conversion of the niece of Tupas was underway in Cebu, Portuguese who learned of the presence of the Spaniards in Cebu sent their expedition to dislodge them and claim their rights over the jurisdiction on the Philippines. And this compelled Legazpi to leave Cebu and sought protection in the nearby island of Panay. It was from their temporary base in Panay where small bands of conquistadores were dispatched to explore the northern part of the Visayas and the southern part, and reaching as far as the southern part of mainland Luzon in what is now the Bicol region. Dispatched with these colonialist sorties were two newly arrived Augustinian friars, Fray Alonso Jimenez and Fray Juan de Alba, was an aging missionary at that time, almost around 70 years old, and they were dispatched according to order so that they would act as protector de los indios, or in order to avoid offenses to God and abuses to the natives. The designation of protector de los indios was conferred upon the missionaries, particularly the early Augustinian missionaries, knowing the fact that expeditions were generally attended to with so much abuses as it happened in South America. And for that reason, missionaries carried an informal designation of Protector de los Indios. It was from these inter-island explorations that Legazpi learned of the wealthy and most populous Muslim villages in what is now called Maynilad, where they eventually transferred in 1571 and established the Spanish colonial and mission capital. Realizing the great need for more missionaries to cope with the growing demands for conversion and a greatly expanded mission geography, the Augustinians as well as the colonial officials petitioned the crown to send series of reinforcements. Other missionary groups responded to this apostolic calling, such as the Franciscans, the Jesuits, the Dominicans, and the Recollects. In response to an earlier request made by the Augustinian provincial Fray Diego de Herrera, a band of Franciscans being organized to be sent to the Solomon Islands, an island east of New Guinea within the Spanish jurisdiction, was dispatched instead to the Philippines. Upon arrival in the islands, the Franciscans were temporarily housed in the Augustinian monastery in Intramuros until moving to their own residence few months after. It was from this humble lodging where they initially launched the evangelization of portions of Manila, such as Santa Ana de Sapa, Paco, Pandacan, Sampaloc, and San Francisco del Monte. From their base in the capital, the Franciscans spread to the southern portion of the Tagalog region with virtual monopoly of the villages in the Bicol Peninsula. The subsequent arrival of more friars prompted the foundation of the province of St. Gregory the Great on November 15, 1586. The Franciscans were followed by the Jesuits, who came on the same ship with the first bishop of the Philippines, the Dominican Fray Domingo de Salazar, where they landed in the Bay of Ibalon in 1581, in July of 1581, and after an exhausting 3-month overland journey, arrived in Manila in September of the same year. These first Jesuits were composed of Father Antonio Cedeño, Alonso Sanchez, Brother Nicolas Gallardo, who arrived in Manila, where they temporarily lodged at Lagyo, a village between Ermita and Malate. Afterwards, the Jesuits were given as portion of the Visayas, with their base in Cebu as part of their mission territory. Although a number of Dominicans were already in the islands in 1581, as they were accompanying Bishop Domingo de Salazar, the order only formally assumed their mission 5 years after, with the arrival of 15 of their confreres in the port of Cavite on July 21, 1587. Notwithstanding the increasing missionaries' presence, they remained disproportionate in relation to the vast expanse of native territories open for conversion. The urgency and relentless demands for more missionaries inspired another religious order to send their personnel in the islands. Arriving in May 1606 were 23 Augustinian Recollect missionaries, 19 priests, and 4 brothers, led by Fray Juan de San Jeronimo. Being the last of the 5 pioneering religious orders to come to the islands in the first half of the Spanish conquest, the Recollects were assigned at first in Manila, where they founded the convent of Bagumbayan, with the more vibrant villages already occupied by the other groups of missionaries. The Recollects were basically left with the most remote and inhospitable regions inhabited by hostile natives, particularly areas along the blazing path of the Moro raids. The increasing number of missionaries, enabling them to extend their presence in various parts of the islands, also posed potential problems in terms of jurisdiction. For the opening of more missions increased the possibility of overstepping territorial boundaries. To forestall the potential outbreak of jurisdictional conflicts, Philip II intervened through a royal decree issued on April 27, 1594, the relevant substance of these reads. Because we learned that the religious sent at our expense to the islands of the Philippines for the new spiritual conquest will have better results by being divided among its order, we command the Governor General and the Archbishop to divide the provinces under his charge among the religious orders for the teaching of the doctrine and conversion of the natives, in the manner that wherever there are Augustinians, there should be no Franciscans, nor religious of the company where there are Dominicans, unquote. This decree also addressed another major concerns among the missionaries, the need for familiarizing with the native language and culture. As noted by the renowned expert on the early Spanish regime in the Philippines, John Palan, this method of partitioning the islands into mission territories of respective religious orders offered one particular practical advantage that, to quote him, it enabled its order to concentrate its linguistic studies in not more than 4 different languages. That's the reason why the Augustinians, in a way, the earliest to evangelize, which occupied vast territories and with different ethno-linguistic groups under their jurisdiction, had to cope with tremendous burden of learning the languages and adapting to different cultural traits. And with this partitioning, it enabled them to specialize on at most 3 different languages. In compliance with the royal decree, the Augustinians who ceded to the Franciscans some of their earlier evangelized territories, such as those in southern Tagalog and Bicol area, had also to share with the Jesuits their missions in the Visayas, and likewise lost to the Dominicans their missions, particularly the Ilocos and Cagayan area. With only the Tagalog region and few mission outposts in Pampanga, Ilocos, and those in the Visayas left under the Augustinian administration, they were able to, as I said earlier, they were able to concentrate only in 3 or 4 distinct ethno-linguistic units. This jurisdictional arrangement defines in large measure certain mechanisms on the foundation and administration of the first dioceses outside Manila, as pointed out in the letter of the first bishop of the Diocese of Cebu, the Augustinian Fray Pedro de Agurto, noting that, to quote his letter, "The royal cedula of your majesty ordered that each order should have a province by itself and should provide its own bishop," unquote. This strategy was apparently an attempt to avoid the problems which earlier erupted between Bishop Domingo de Salazar and the Augustinians, which also includes the Franciscans and the Jesuits later on. In compliance with this decree, when the other suffragan dioceses of Cebu, Bigan, and Nueva Cáceres were created, the first bishops assigned were those belonging to the dominant order occupying the territory, namely In Nueva Cáceres, an exclusive Franciscan mission was assigned the Franciscan Fray Luis Maldonado. In Cebu, a predominantly Augustinian territory but shared with the Jesuits and later on with the Recollects, was assigned the Augustinian Fray Pedro de Agurto. And in the Diocese of Nueva Segovia, earlier on a territory controlled by the Augustinians but later on ceded to the Dominicans, was assigned a Dominican, Fray Miguel de Benavides. Archival sources testified to the tremendous ordeal suffered by the missionaries in the early salvo of evangelization. In an official inquiry made in 1597, several natives and Spanish residents testified to the enormous hardships Augustinian missionaries endured in introducing Christianity to the natives of Ilocos. One declarante testified, to quote him, "The religious of St. Augustine were the first who labored in matters of our Catholic faith, and in this work devoted themselves even until the present. Many died from their work because in order to baptize one of them, they have to travel 3 or 4 leagues inland on foot and by water and perish afterwards due to exhaustion," unquote. Even the Dominican chronicler, Fray Diego de Aduarte, who wrote in the latter part of the 17th century, was impressed by the endurance but could only sympathize for their miseries the missionaries suffered. And he wrote, "Sometimes they went from one village to another by sea in tiny boats, but for much of the time it was necessary to go by land through an overflowed and muddy country, so that they thought at best to walk barefooted and bare-legged. After they arrived where they were going, they prepared themselves to hear confession or to baptize, all wet and muddy as they were, as indeed necessity compelled them to do. They had no other food than a little rice boiled with nothing but water, and sometimes a little bit of fish to eat if the Indians happen to have any. They have the floor of an Indian hut for bed, and for cover, their wet apparel and nothing else. They live and labored thus, a harvest of souls for God," unquote. The missionaries' greatest torment came from the natives' widespread and overwhelming resistance, in some instances even violent. Nevertheless, the initial anti-colonial resistance was palpably led by chieftains who, except for Tupas, most quickly yielded to Spanish pressure. The more obdurate but effectively subtle native resistance was inspired by the native priestesses known in the Visayas as Babaylan and known in the Tagalog region as Katalunan or Katulunan in some documents. These native priestesses possess comprehensive power which extended beyond the religious sphere. Their obtrusive and disruptive presence was evident in the reports of various religious orders in the first half of the 17th century. And they were replete with frightening narratives of ordeals heroically suffered by the missionaries, which were instigated mainly by these priestesses. Owing to the mounting violence mainly attributed to these priestesses, the missionaries realized that to accomplish the work of conversion, it was primordially necessary to suppress the power of these Baylan or Katulunan, either by persuasion or by coercion. This militant approach of the missionaries was part of the imperial mandate in dealing with the native region in conquered territories. The decree indeed was unforgiving and called for an aggressive effort to put a stop, and should be stopped, the worship of idols, altars of native idolatry, and their sacrifices. categorically forbid with grave punishment the natives from engaging in idolatry, unquote. The same decree threatened with punishment those who remained hard, stubborn, and obstinate in their error, refusing to believe that which the Holy Mother Church holds and teaches. Aside from the coercive techniques employed by the missionaries in extirpating the idolatrous practices, including subjecting the priestesses to public whipping, one of the most ingenious was the use of children to spy on them. By subtly inquiring on the identity of those engaged in the practice of idolatry, owing to their lack of appreciation of their acts against the religious beliefs of their heathen parents, children were allowed by the missionaries to perform vandalistic mockery on objects held sacred by the native religion to show that their gods and ancestral spirits had no power to harm them. Duarte recalled of such instance, and to quote him, "It was easy to find some little idols that they kept hidden, which were handed over to the Christian boys to drag about through the whole village, and at last were burned. By this means, and by the punishment of a few old women who acted as priestesses and who were called katulunans, the idolatry of the whole region was brought to an end." Unquote. It was in view of this approach that the 17th century Augustinian chronicler Fray Gaspar de San Agustin referred to the process of Christianization as a dual enterprise, demanding both temporal and spiritual conquest, as suggested in the title of his book, Conquistas de las Islas, lo temporal por las armas del Señor Don Felipe II el Prudente, y la espiritual por los religiosos del orden de nuestro Padre San Agustin. Indeed, the missionaries saw themselves as crusaders engaged in fierce battles against a retinue of infernal forces led by these priestesses whom they accused of being spiritual agents of Satan. Triumphalist narratives of religious orders highlighted their battles, not only with those they condemned as idolatrous practitioners, but with their allies, the monstrous creatures. Such narratives affirmed the preponderant role of grace and divine intervention. When within such theoretical matrix, it is understandable that late 16th and early 17th century mission narratives abounded in tales of miraculous cures, occurrences of spectacular supernatural phenomena such as levitations, bilocations, and even restoration of life to a dead person. The Augustinian proto-missionary Bicol, Fray Alonso Jimenez, earned saintly veneration and won the natives of the port village of Ibalon for allegedly reviving a chieftain believed to have been dead for 4 days. It was from this that they wove a discourse which validated the palpable and immeasurable omnipotence of the Christian God. The missionaries, in most instances, the only European residing for an indefinite period of time in the most remote, barely accessible, and completely strange world of the natives, carrying out the arduous task of religious and comprehensive cultural conversion of the people, face not only grave personal risks, but untold inconveniences to survive. One of their most valuable survival weapons was language. It was in view of their missions that the king made the learning of the local language obligatory. The royal cedula issued by Philip II in 1578 of the Recopilation, and it reads, "We command and urge that priests, clerics, or religious who would be going to our Indies in elsewhere in those places and intend to serve in the doctrinas or benefices of the natives would not be allowed unless they know the general language of the locality they would administer." The Augustinians and most of the succeeding missionary groups incorporated the studies and composition of vocabularies and grammar rules of regions they were assigned to in their evangelizing work. The Grammatica Tagala, the first grammar on the Tagalog language, was said to have been composed around 1570 by Fray Agustin de Albuquerque. Owing to the centrality of the Tagalog region in their mission chart, more works came out in this language from succeeding Augustinian missionaries, such as the 1581 Arte e Vocabulario Tagala attributed to Fray Juan Quiñones. Following the footsteps of the Augustinian grammarians and lexicographers, the Franciscans could be considered as next in terms of their accomplishments in linguistic works during the first half century of the evangelization. Fray Juan de Plasencia, the first among the Franciscans to undertake this task, reported on June 18, 1585, his preliminary works on the Tagalog language. To quote him, "I have written something such as the Arte of the language and the Declaración or explanation of the Catholic doctrine, and I am now working on a vocabulary that are very necessary for all ministers if they would be printed." Learning the native language was apparently a taxing job for the missionaries, particularly the aging ones. Sa Duarte could only sympathize with the ordeal of two aging, pioneering Dominican missionaries who were, according to Duarte, got beyond the time of learning, spending their entire day in the exhausting work of preaching and teaching the natives. Many still had to make the most, according to Grijalba, of the entire night in learning the language and preparing sermons for certain masses they are going to deliver. Study of the native language was not only intended to establish a regular line of bilateral communication with the native society, but also to serve as a means to translate and transfer Hispanic culture into the malleable minds of the young natives through the conventual education, the first form of primary instruction. In accordance with the method prescribed by the Recopilación through the 1572 decree of Philip II, the Augustinians and the rest of the missionary orders thereafter focused their instruction to a small number of precocious young boys to be taught not only on the essential features of Hispanic culture, but more importantly on the basic principles of Christianity by bringing them to live in the monastery. The early 17th century chronicler, Fray Juan de Grijalba, provided a glimpse of this basic system of instruction adopted by the Augustinian order in the various missions in the islands. And it says, "They also ask these islanders for your children to grow in their customs and doctrine. As such, because it is the easiest way and more secure, as they were hoping to have help, as in effect they have. The Indians who loved them not most and were close to their life, they gave their children with great desire, to which they were taught the Christian doctrine, to read, write, and sing, and above all, to fear God." While teaching or preaching were the most universal method for the natives' religious and secular transformation, the missionaries realized that a sustained process also demanded a permanent venue conducive for both social and economic interaction, compelling the missionaries to relocate the settlements. The concept of urbanization introduced by the Franciscans acquired structural implementation with the Jesuits and the Augustinians' adoption of Western architecture and system of engineering techniques in their mission territories. An enduring and shining proof of the Augustinian sophisticated engineering and architectural skills introduced in the Philippines was the church and convent of San Pablo in Intramuros, now the San Agustin Church. Started in 1599 and finished in the first years of the 17th century. This Western concept was also introduced in other parts of the Augustinian mission, such as in the Bicol region, where Fray Juan de Horta was said to have introduced the Western style of construction in the 1570s. The process of change, conversion, and urbanization set in motion in the reducciones or doctrinas was carried further with the inculcation of other basic elements of Hispanic culture, such as in science, arts, literature, drama, music, farming, engineering, etc., introduced by the missionaries. Asserting the contributions of his fellow Franciscans, the 17th century chronicler, Fray Marcelo de Ribadeneira, wrote, "Since the religious know many things, the religious acted like a father, visiting the natives in their sickness, consoling and assisting them in their needs, teaching them how to plant some which they do not have, and even introducing mechanical knowledge needed for living as human beings." Among those whose contributions had tremendous impact in the life of the natives was that of Martin de Rada, who was described as a great mathematician, geometrician, and astrologer. The earliest recorded inventory of local flora was made by the Franciscan Fray Blas de la Madre de Dios around the later part of the 16th century, known as the Ona Flora Filipina. And he also wrote a thesis on domestic medicine, a very, very important contribution in the growth of the medical science. Western arts and music, colorful and integral features of Catholic ceremonies, were among those introduced in the early phase of conversion. Fray Andres de Aguirre, a companion of Ordeneta in the Philippines, described how the dramatic presentation of the Catholic doctrine to the employment of music and songs greatly attracted and facilitated the natives' conversion to Catholicism, aside from the graphic representation of major Catholic narratives through the sacred statues and retablos. And he wrote, "The libros de cantos were very necessary to sing the divine office and the masses as they did in New Spain. It is done in these islands by the natives, since they are very talented and are taught and learned with great ease in reading and writing and in singing. And due to the absence of song books, one could not sing the office and the masses, which are celebrated with this, with great solemnity, and have great effects on the conversion of those still unconverted and in the confirmation of those already converted." The natives of the 16th century generally received them with gratitude, as evident in a testimony by a native elite or Indio principal of Lubao, Pampanga in 1591, then an Augustinian mission territory. Don Juan Lisin testified that all the young children have learned to read, write Latin, and the Romance languages, knowing very well to recite the divine office and chants in the Mass, accompanied by an organ, and touching the ministriles and flutes with great expertise. The witness affirmed having been taught by the said fathers, which enabled them to live in great civic order. But the greatest and enduring legacy bequeathed by the missionaries in the first of their presence, other than the faith, was the introduction of higher education, one of the first in Southeast Asia. But the first truly educational activities beyond the catechism classes were also started by the Augustinians when they opened the seminary of the monastery of San Pablo de Manila in 1572. The greatest contribution in the intellectual development to the educational system would come from the Jesuits and the Dominicans. The earliest proposal for the establishment of a center of higher learning in the modern sense came as early as 1583 from the Jesuit rector Father Antonio Cedeño, who requested the king to allow them to devote their efforts in developing the children of the city and islands and teaching grammar to them, and to prepare young men who would be occupying positions of power by making them, quote him, to read some works of philosophy and theology, or at least on cases of conscience. It took, however, more than a decade before the proposal was realized in 1595 when a college called Maximo, or popular as University of San Ignacio in Manila, was founded. This became, which was the forerunner of the Ateneo de Manila. The most important episode in the intellectual journey of the early Filipinos came when the Dominicans founded their most prominent institution of higher learning, which is now the University of Santo Tomas. A royal decree issued on 25 July 1609 suggested that a plan had already been conceived by the Bishop of Nueva Segovia regarding the founding of a colegio of about which he described as having about 20 colegiales teologos, artistas, in the city of Manila to be administered by the Order of Saint Dominic, where, according to him, where one may read the works of Saint Thomas as it is done in the Reformed universities, and the funds from the natives should be used for the support of the colegiales. Finally, the successful conversion of the Philippines by the early missionaries transformed the Philippines into the base for the conversion of Southeast Asia and even of China and Japan. For as early as 1570s, the Augustinians, together with the colonial forces led by Legazpi, had already been longing to undertake the spiritual and temporal conquest of some powerful kingdoms such as China and Japan. In fact, on 25 July 1570, while still based in Panay, Legazpi wrote the king suggesting the need for the transfer of the Spaniards to Manila because of the fact that it was closer to China and Japan. What we might call as the pious ambition for the spiritual conquest of these neighboring kingdoms such as China and Japan and the Malay Peninsula was set in motion when Fray Martin de Rada and Fray Agustin de Albuquerque eventually attempted and succeeded entering the reclusive kingdom of China. Other religious orders such as the Franciscans and the Jesuits had also fixed their gaze on this territory. In his letter, dated October 12, 1579, more than a year after their arrival in the islands, Fray Pedro Alparo, the custodian of the Franciscans in the Philippines, confessed of his secret journey to China to explore the possibility of establishing missions in this kingdom. Part of his narrative was the ordeal and the tremendous risk they went through, inasmuch as he traveled without official royal permit, which endangered not only his life but also the political relations with the Chinese emperor. Alfaro begged for forgiveness and accepted full and exclusive responsibility for this act. Their dreams, however, for the spiritual conquest of these regions were dashed to pieces when these kingdoms eventually closed their doors to foreign missionaries. Thank you very much.